Hello, welcome back to Inspirational Landscapes, and this is the second part of Chapter 4. And in this session we're talking about the sky, the ocean, wilderness, space, different settings in which we can encounter landscape in a very specific sort of way that helps us to investigate in more detail some of the issues that we've talked about earlier in the module. And the basic point that we've made so far is this, that if you engage with landscapes in different ways, then you will notice different things about them, partly because different things about them become important when you engage with them in these different ways. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this session. We encountered John Constable in an earlier session in this module. We looked at his famous landscape painting, the Hay Wain, and I want to begin this session with something that he said. He said, "We see nothing truly till we understand it." And part of his process in painting was almost scientific in nature, that he really wanted to understand the weather, he wanted to understand the clouds, and by understanding them he was then able to paint them. And there's this extract from a paper by John Thorns, a cultural climatologist, says that the accuracy of his paintings was based on that scientific understanding, and people have actually used Constable's paintings of skies to reconstruct weather, to reconstruct climate from the period when he was painting. But the key point there for us is that quote at the top: we don't see something properly until we understand it. So it's worth doing the research, doing the work on a landscape or on whatever it is you're looking at, because only then will you see it properly. Now that's a particular approach, or a scientific approach, if you like, that I guess many of us coming through the background that we have done and studying geography at university now, a lot of us will be familiar with that very scientific approach to understanding something, and then you think you can see it properly. And here's something else he said: painting is a science, and it should be pursued as an inquiry into the laws of nature. Why then may not landscape painting be considered as a branch of natural philosophy? And pictures are just the experiments. So he's very much thinking of art and science in that combined way. And that art-science crossover is, of course, an important theme of this module as well. So since Constable's talking about skies and getting us into the module in that direction, let's carry on thinking about the sky, the air, and our engagement with that. We discussed earlier whether you would consider the sky a landscape, but for now we're going to assume that it is, and we're going to think about different ways in which we might engage with that landscape. Now the next few slides are actually borrowed from Dr. Waller. Many of you will know Richard Waller. Another of the lecturers who's involved in this program that many of you are doing, and he has an interest in gliding. He has some experience of flying gliders, and he's made the point that by flying gliders, it's given him a very different perspective both on the air itself, the sky itself, if you like, and also on views of the ground from the air. So let's just work through these couple of pictures that he's given us and have a think about how we would engage differently with the sky, with the atmosphere, with the air, and how we would view the ground differently if we're engaging with it from the position of being in a glider, flying a glider. Well, if you're flying a glider, then obviously the first thing you want to do is stay flying. You don't want to crash to the ground too quickly. So you're looking for rising currents of air that will help to keep you aloft. So you're looking, for example, for thermals. And thermals, rising currents of warm air, can be generated in a number of ways, but basically it's by heating the ground surface, and that causes air to rise in pockets, and necessarily therefore also to be falling in other locations. The air circulating around these rising packets of warm air. Sometimes that will be revealed, as in the bottom image there, by a cloud, and it can be controlled by a variety of different things. For example, if a farmer has ploughed up a field, that can lead to the generation of thermals, or patterns, as you can see here in the third slide up. Topographic conditions can lead to some patches of the ground heating up more than other patches of the ground, and leading to conditions of rising air. So as a glider pilot, we're looking for these circulation patterns in the atmosphere, particularly for the rising air. We're trying to avoid the falling air, and we're going to be very conscious, therefore, of conditions on the ground that are going to be controlling that rise and fall of air that ideally will give us the opportunity to rise to a great height and then be able to glide a great distance. Now, thermals aren't the only source of lift for a glider pilot. The air can also generate lift, or the air itself can be lifted as it rises over a topographic high point. So in this picture, for example, the air is flowing from right to left, and as it flows, you can see there's a certain amount of uplift here, a great deal of uplift here, and a little bit of uplift here. So you can position your glider to make the most of the greatest amount of uplift at a particular position over this ridge. And this is an aerial shot of the landscape in which the airfield is that Rich took off in his glider, and he's trying to use the topography to generate this lift. So we're looking at high points, low points, we're looking at topographic ridges, but a ridge per se isn't going to generate lift. You need airflow across that ridge. So where the lift is going to happen isn't just going to depend on the topography, it's going to depend on the wind direction as well. And when the wind is coming from one direction, you may well get ridge lift as the wind flows up onto a highland area, but if the wind's flowing in the other direction, you're not going to get it. So in any particular location, there are going to be good days and less good days for gliding and getting the lift in the location where you want it. In some situations, we're not just dealing with a single ridge and a single lift point. We sometimes can generate, by virtue of the topography, a series of waves in the atmosphere. And so a glider can gain height at certain locations, then glide across the dead zone to the next location where they can gain height, then glide across the next dead zone to the next location. And this picture on the right is here to illustrate the fact that sometimes these airflow patterns are revealed for us in the sky, in the clouds. So we're not only looking at the ground and looking for topography that might be generating lift, we're also looking across the sky to look for clouds that are telling us that that lift is being generated. Because in this location on the left-hand diagram, where the air is rising, there's a critical threshold in moisture availability within the atmosphere, and at that point the lift is generating these wave clouds that you can see ahead of you in the picture here. So the glider pilot is watching the ground, he's watching ahead in the sky and trying to pick out these areas where clues are telling him, landscape clues are telling him about landscape processes. So the clouds are telling us about the lift, the topography is hinting to us where we might find that lift. So when you and I are standing on the ground or sitting in our deck chairs admiring the sky, we might be thinking about whether the clouds are going to block out the sun or where the next rain shower is coming from. But if we're flying a glider, we have very different and very specific other concerns that we need to keep our eye on. So because we're encountering the sky in our glidering activity, we therefore are noticing different things because different things are becoming important to us. So in our mission of trying to see new things in the world around us, trying new activities, or at least seeing through the eyes of people who are doing those activities, is really useful to us. Now in that context, Dr. Waller has been very useful to us because not only has he provided us with some slides of his gliding experiences, he's also given me some slides of his sea kayaking experiences. And I just want to, again, exactly the same thing. Imagine we're in a boat out on the water. What's our different perspective going to be, both of the water, but also the perspective looking back at the land that we're more familiar with? So here's you and I sitting on the beach looking out to sea, admiring the waves and soaking up the rays. There's Rich out on his kayak. What are our different concerns? What are our different worries? Well, the first and very obvious point is that you see different things depending on where you're looking from. So if we're on land on this cliff, we'd see the grass, we'd see there was a drop off, and we'd see out to sea, but we wouldn't actually notice any of this fantastic coastal geomorphology, which from the perspective of somebody standing on the land is inaccessible and virtually invisible. But as soon as you get out on the water and look back at the land, that view back at the land enables you to see very different things from what people who are actually on the land can see. So being in situ on the land, being in place, isn't actually the best place to be to get a good look at something. To get a good look at something is often best to be able to go and stand away from it, go and sail away from it and look back at it from elsewhere. So that's the first point that comes out of these slides of Richard's sea kayaking experiences. And you'll have had similar if you've been on ships. The view of the land looking back is very different from the view of the land when you're on it. But also, the view of the sea itself is different, and not only in the physical sense of being able to see things closer up than you can see them from the land, but also the kinds of things that you're actually interested in. So when I'm sitting on the beach, I'm wondering about the tide coming in and going out, just to make sure I haven't got my deck chair down too low and I'm not going to get my feet wet. But if you're paddling your kayak, then the tides don't just mean that the water is coming higher and lower. The tides are driving very strong currents in the water, and those strong currents and the way that they interact are driving wave patterns in the water as well. So knowing the tides and positioning yourself and navigating yourself relative to those tides is a really fundamentally important thing in staying safe and in traveling effectively if you're traveling on the sea in a kayak. And Rich made the point to me once that it was a really fascinating experience for him, and this is going to tie into a point that we'll talk about Antoine de Saint-Exupéry making later on in this session. But Rich made the point that there he is, a tiny figure in his tiny boat out on the massive ocean. But it isn't just that he's a small figure on a big ocean, he's a small figure, the behavior of which, or the behavior of whom, is being conditioned by literally astronomical scale processes. So it's the interaction of the sun, the moon, and the earth. That's what's driving the tides, and that's what's then controlling his activity upon the ocean. And often doing activities that enable us to engage with landscape in some way, such as this, are ways in which we can more effectively bridge that gap, if you like, between the human scale and the cosmic scale. And that's another theme that we've talked about a lot in this module, and we'll continue to do so. That question of noticing things at different scales and recognizing the context of us being small figures in a cosmic scale landscape environment. I mentioned Antoine de Saint-Exupéry a moment ago, and I'd like to take a few minutes to look at him in more detail. He's an example that we're going to use from time to time throughout the module, and he has a lot to say about landscape and about geography that's very relevant to us in this module. If you haven't heard about it before, go away and look him up and maybe have a look at some of his work, because he's very relevant to a lot of the ideas that we're talking about. Saint-Exupéry was a writer, and he was an aviator. He was involved in the early opening up of early air routes around the Mediterranean, between France and North Africa, and also in South America. And he wrote books both for adults and also ostensibly for children, although his famous children's book, The Little Prince, is also very popular with adults also. And if we just have a little look at that, you'll see how it's relevant to some of the themes that we've been talking about. One of the famous lines, if you like, from Saint-Exupéry is this one: that which is essential is invisible to the eyes. We see clearly only with the heart. So this kind of contrasts maybe with what we heard John Constable saying a little while ago, where he said, you can only see something properly if you understand it. Very scientific approach. Well, that's rather different from this humanistic approach that we're beginning to pick up from Saint-Exupéry here. So let's have a look at some of the things that he said and just try to tie them into some of the ideas that we've been talking about in this module, beginning with this book, The Little Prince. It's only a tiny book. If you haven't looked at it, you can read it in a couple of hours. I strongly recommend it in the context of this module and geography generally. So this is a section from the beginning of the book, early in the book, where he says he did a drawing, and he showed his masterpiece to the grown-ups and asked them whether the drawing frightened them, and they said, well, why on earth should we be frightened by why are we going to be frightened by a hat? And he sighs, oh, God, my picture, the drawing wasn't a picture of a hat. It was a boa constrictor digesting an elephant. And the tone here is kind of, oh, these adults, don't they know anything? Can't they see anything? And he said, oh, well, since the grown-ups weren't able to understand it, I made another drawing, made it simple for them. I drew the inside of a boa constrictor so that the grown-ups could see it clearly. They always need to have things explained. Well, this might remind you of D.W. Meinig. Show 10 people this picture, the top picture there, and ask them what they see. And the engineer, the artist, the boa constrictor farmer, the hat maker, they'll see different things. They'll notice different things until maybe it's explained in more detail. So having said previously that Saint-Exupéry was saying something different from Constable, well, this actually sounds a bit more like Constable. You don't see it clearly until you've understood it, till you've had it explained to you. But Saint-Exupéry here is separating that out between adults and children, and the book's written from the child's perspective, and saying, oh, those stupid adults, they need to have it explained. So maybe the scientists, John Constable, they're the stupid adults. The free thinking, the clear seeing children, they see straight away what it is that we're talking about. And here's a boa constrictor's head, and here's the elephant inside it. And that theme of different people seeing different things, and the scientists, if you like, versus the children noticing different things in the world around them, that continues as the character in the book, the Little Prince, he visits separate planets on which individual characters are operating. And one of the planets that he visits is the planet that has a geographer on it. And we'll see what Saint-Exupéry thinks about geographers. And the geographer says, I'm a geographer. And the Little Prince says, what's that? Oh, a geographer is a scholar who knows the locations of all the seas, rivers, towns, mountains, deserts. Oh, that's interesting, says the Little Prince. Here at last is a man who has a real profession. He looked around the planet. Your planet's very beautiful, says the Little Prince. Has it got any oceans? I couldn't tell you, said the geographer. And it turns out the geographer is actually a bit rubbish in this story, because the geographer can't do anything unless he has an explorer to go out and get the information and bring the information back, and the geographer just handles that information, but he doesn't actually necessarily know much about what's going on. So the geographer here is a little bit useless. And geography and geographers crop up again in another of Saint-Exupéry's books, and this is a book which is more explicitly for adults. And again, it's a book I very strongly recommend to you in the context of this module as well as generally. But in this book, Wind, Sand and Stars, this is a story of a young aviator being introduced to the business of flying, the business of opening up new areas, flying in very primitive conditions, very early conditions when it was a really risky operation. Part of the book at the beginning, he sits down and he's basically shown the ropes by a more experienced aviator before he sets off on a perilous journey across the south of France and towards North Africa, around the Mediterranean. And he talks about this geography lesson. People talk about Saint-Exupéry's geography lesson. And Saint-Exupéry says, what a strange geography lesson I was given. Guillaume didn't teach Spain to me, he made the country my friend. I'm just going to read you a couple of minutes worth from that section. I'd just like you to think about how this connects to what you've studied of geography in your build up to this module, different approaches to geography. So, what a strange geography lesson I was given. Guillaume did not teach Spain to me, he made the country my friend. He did not talk about provinces or peoples or livestock. Instead of telling me about Guadix, he spoke of 3 orange trees on the edge of the town. Oh, beware of those trees, better mark them on the map. And those 3 orange trees seemed to me thenceforth higher than the Sierra Nevada. He did not talk about Lorca, but about a humble farm near Lorca, a living farm with its farmer and the farmer's wife. And this remote couple living 1,000 miles from where we sat took on a universal importance. The details that we drew up from oblivion, from their inconceivable remoteness, no geographer had been concerned to explore. Because it washed the banks of great cities, the Ebro River was of interest to mapmakers. But what had they to do with that brook running secretly through the water weeds to the west of Motril, that brook nourishing a mere score or 2 of flowers? Careful of that brook, it breaks up the whole field, mark it on your map. Ah, I was to remember that serpent in the grass near Motril. It looked like nothing at all, and its faint murmur sang to no more than a few frogs, but it slept with one eye open. Stretching its length along the grasses in the paradise of that emergency landing field, it lay in wait for me 1,000 miles from where I sat. Given the chance, it would transform me into a flaming candelabra, and those 30 valorous sheep ready to charge me on the slope of a hill. Now that I knew about them, I could brace myself to meet them. You think the meadow empty, and suddenly, bang, there are 30 sheep in your wheels. An astounded smile was all I could summon in the face of so cruel a threat. Little by little, under the lamp, the Spain of my map became a sort of fairyland. The crosses marked to indicate safety zones and traps were so many buoys and beacons. I charted the farmer, the 30 sheep, the brook, and, exactly where she stood, I set a buoy to mark the shepherdess forgotten by the geographers. So one of the themes that you begin to pick up here is that there's our idea of geographers. I guess we think geographers are okay. Most of us doing this module are doing geographers. But then there's this particular opinion of geography and geographers that Saint-Exupéry is expressing, where he's saying, well, these important bits of what he's calling geography, he says that real geographers seem to ignore professional geographers. Geography doesn't pay any attention to this shepherdess, to this tiny stream. Now, obviously, Saint-Exupéry is writing, getting on for 100 years ago, he was flying, so it's a long time ago since he wrote this, but it's worth your while thinking, to what extent does your idea of geography, based on your reading of recent geography, particularly some cultural geographies perhaps, how does it compare with Saint-Exupéry's idea? So there's a different perspective here from someone who, I'm going to put him under the heading of explorer and writer, and he has a very different idea of what geography and geographers are like from what may be the idea that we have of what geography and geographers are like. So as part of this module of seeing things through different people's eyes, have a look at geography through Saint-Exupéry's eyes. Maybe have a look at The Little Prince, have a look at Wind, Sand and Stars, and have a think about what he's saying, and decide whether you think he's right or not. And this is a really important point. As with everything in this module, when we talk about them in the sessions, we tend to talk about them from our personal experience, our own point of view. And I hope and I imagine and I expect that you're going away and you're doing some academic reading around that later on. So this is really just a reminder that for every topic that we're talking about in this module, even these novels these stories by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, there is an academic framework within which you can contextualize your own opinions, your own views of that. So here, for example, is a paper about Saint-Exupéry's geography lesson and the way it relates to our understanding of landscape, values, geography, and so on. And this quotation on the screen here is from the abstract to that paper. And he says, Saint-Exupéry's geography lesson, so in other words, what I just read to you out of Wind, Sand and Stars, Saint-Exupéry's geography lesson is critical of official generalized geographies that are irrelevant to life worlds, humane values and spirituality. Well, that may well ring a bell then if you've read what a lot of geographers were saying in the 1950s, 60s, 70s through to the present day, saying that yeah, traditional classical geography kind of got that wrong and it ignored this stuff. And so to what extent would you now think that we're not ignoring that stuff so much? I mean, we're 30 years on now, even from Bunksy's paper. I mean, is it the case now that is still true? Or do geographers now have, do even the official geographies now have a better approach to life worlds, humane values and spirituality? Or is that just the kind of thing we're doing in this module? I just want to read you another extract from Wind, Sand and Stars, and this is actually an extract that you can find in the book Language of the Earth, which was one of the recommended books for this module. This is just telling another episode from Saint-Exupéry's flying adventures. And he says, by the grace of the airplane, so that's what we're talking about here, by encountering the landscape from a different perspective. And he says, by the grace of the airplane, I have known a more extraordinary experience than this, and have been made to ponder with even more bewilderment the fact that this earth that is our home is yet in truth a wandering star. A minor accident had forced me down in the Rio de Oro region in Spanish Africa. Landing on one of those tablelands of the Sahara, which fall away steeply at the sides, I found myself on the flat top of the frustrum of a cone, an isolated vestige of a plateau that had crumbled around the edges. In this part of the Sahara, such truncated cones are visible from the air every 100 miles or so, their smooth surfaces always at about the same altitude above the desert, and their geologic substance always identical. The surface sand is composed of minute and distinct shells, but progressively, as you dig along a vertical section, the shells become more fragmentary, tend to cohere, and at the base of the cone form a pure calcareous deposit. Without question, I was the first human being ever to wander over this iceberg. Its sides were remarkably steep. I was thrilled by the virginity of a soil which no step of man or beast had sullied. I lingered there, startled by this silence that had never been broken. The first star began to shine, and I said to myself that this pure surface had lain here thousands of years, in sight only of the stars. But suddenly my musings on this white sheet and these shining stars were endowed with a singular significance. I had kicked against a hard black stone the size of a man's fist, a sort of moulded rock of lava, incredibly present on the surface of a bed of shells 1,000 feet deep. A sheet spread beneath an apple tree can receive only apples. A sheet spread beneath the stars can receive only stardust. Never had a stone fallen from the skies made known its origin so unmistakably. And very naturally, raising my eyes, I said to myself that from the height of this celestial apple tree there must have dropped other fruits, and that I should find them exactly where they fell, since never from the beginning of time had anything been present to displace them. Excited by my adventure, I picked up one, and then a second, and then a third of these stones, finding them at about the rate of 1 stone to the acre. And here is where my adventure became magical. For in a striking foreshortening of time that embraced thousands of years, I had become the witness of this miserly rain from the stars. The marvel of marvels was that there on the rounded back of the planet, between this magnetic sheet and those stars, a human consciousness was present in which, as in a mirror, that rain could be reflected. Now, you might want to go and read that extract for yourselves, or listen to it again, but there are a lot of things in there that I hope rang a bell with you, just struck a chord for things that we've been talking about previously in the module. As I was reading it, I was thinking of the dark side of the moon exercise that we did earlier, and the idea of a patch of land which points out to space and can't be seen, and from which you can't see certain things. There are a lot of connections in there with things that we've talked about previously. But I want to move forward rather than look backwards at this stage. And I want to start thinking about another term that is going to become very important in this module, and that's the idea of wilderness. And that's something that what Saint-Exupéry was talking about there very much leads us onto. The sky, the ocean, the desert that he was talking about there, and that he talks about in great detail in the Little Prince. I guess to us we would very quickly call those wilderness. But how do we define wilderness? And are we right? Is the sky a wilderness? Does that make any sense? Well, how are we going to decide the answer to that? What questions might we ask ourselves, or what people might we ask about whether the sky, the ocean, the desert is a wilderness? We might say, for example, well, is it an untouched area? So as Saint-Exupéry was talking about there in his discussion of the table land with the meteorites on it where he hadn't, where no one had been, is that wilderness because people haven't affected that, people haven't touched that? Is it untamed? Does it inspire some particular reaction in you? Is that we're talking about inspirational landscapes? Well, what sense does wilderness inspire? Does it, for example, inspire fear, or does it inspire a sense of freedom? So there are lots of different things that we might put on a checklist and say, well, okay, in order to count as wilderness, it needs to match up to these different things. And I'd like you to start thinking about that. I'd like you to make a checklist of, well, what makes wilderness, and what are the criteria by which we'll say, yes, this is a wilderness, this isn't a wilderness. At the same time as you're already, I hope, doing that for landscape, what are the criteria by which we say, yep, the sky is or isn't a landscape, a face is or isn't a landscape? And again, as well as just using your own opinion, splendid though that is, or just using my opinion, we want to go and get other people's opinions. We want to look in the literature. But who else might we ask? What kind of person might we go to and say, what do you think wilderness is? And we think they'll give us a worthwhile, useful, valuable answer in the context of this module. Well, obviously there are lots of different people that we might usefully ask, but one opinion would be the opinion of an explorer, someone who is used to going into what they define as wilderness. And there's one more concluding slide after this one, but as soon as we finish this, I'd like you to go on and watch this video from Robert Perkins called Into the Great Solitude. You can find it on YouTube, and the link is here, and I'll put a link in the KLE for you to follow as well. But just watch the first 10 minutes or so, and it tells the story of how he set off into a great adventure in the wilderness, and it tells you his experience, tells you about his experiences on that journey. If it helps, I've just put some questions on the right-hand side of this slide. You can copy those down, and maybe as you're watching the video, just to help you focus on some of the things that he talks about that are relevant to what we're saying in this module. Just try and catch the answers to these questions as you work your way through that video with Perkins. So I'm going to draw to a close there. The point I've been trying to make is the one on the slide here. If you engage with landscapes in different ways, or if you encounter other people who have engaged with landscapes in different ways, they will have seen different things. They'll have seen things differently because different things are important to them. If you're on a boat, if you're flying a plane, different parts of the landscape become very relevant to you. Now, obviously, you encounter landscape on a day-to-day basis in your daily activities, but I'd like you to become more specifically conscious of that as we move into the module, and to think very carefully about how you're engaging. Think about how you're engaging with landscape. So is it in real life, going out of doors and looking at the landscape around you? Are you seeing landscapes on TV? Are you reading about them? What are you reading? What are you seeing? What is it that you're talking about? And in particular, I'd like you to just watch out for opportunities to throw in ideas from this module. So imagine I said that you whatever your next engagement with landscape is, you have to produce a 5-minute segment for this module based on that encounter with a landscape. What can you tie to your landscape encounter that relates to some of the things that we've been talking about in this module, or to some of the characters that we've invoked? So what would Saint-Exupéry say about your landscape? What would John Constable say about your landscape? What would your experience mean in the context of, well, suppose you were there on a boat or in a glider? Just try to tie your real life experiences to your experiences within the module. Now, this is the end of this session, so as you move on, the next thing I'd like you to do is go and watch that Perkins video, Into the Great Solitude, and then we'll carry on with our next item after that.